Hey guys, thanks for checking out my video. What we're going to look at today, I have this old Radio Shack Porsche. It's a Porsche 935 made by Radio Shack, Tandy Racing. This is from, what I can tell, from 1981 this was released. So this car is currently somewhere around 39 years old, depending on exactly when it was manufactured. Good to see these old cars that survived, as I'm sure anyone who's around these type of toys knows, or children. Most of these things were given to kids as gifts for holidays or birthdays, and us kids would, you know, beat the crap out of them until they were broken or destroyed. You know, best case, you'd end up with a beat-up car with some parts missing, and worst case, it's in the landfill somewhere and never to be seen again. But not this one. This one survived. It's in excellent condition. This is owned by a friend of mine from work. He's a big Porsche fan. So he got to wondering if we could take this and put some modern electronics in it. It did work, from what he said. I don't have the radio, the original radio here with me. I couldn't test it. But, you know, we're going to see if we can take it apart, get a regular servo in here, maybe an inexpensive speed controller, 2.4 gigahertz radio, lithium battery instead of the bunch of C cells that it ran on from the factory. And then probably leave the motor and drivetrain alone. Reason being, these old cars, the parts in here, you're not going to be able to get them in a store anywhere. What you'd have to do if you broke something is find another one of these that survived, hopefully in worse condition, and just pick it up and strip it out for parts. You know, if we end up putting a bigger motor in here or something like that, it might overtax the drivetrain, strip some gears. We don't want to do that, so we're going to leave that alone. Everything else looks great. So, with that being said, let's get this body shell off and see what we're dealing with inside here. All right. So we've removed, usually these cars have 8 screws, these old cars, holding them together, 2 in the front, 4 in the center, 2 in the rear. You want to be careful, you just take those out and not anything else, because, you know, these are holding some of the drivetrain in probably. If there were screws here, they'd be holding the steering in. You don't want to mess with those. So I took those 8 screws out. There they are. We're going to just flip her over, lift this off. All right. And here's what we got. All right, I'm going to flip this around so I can put the wires to the side. And we're going to try not to get poked in the eye with this thing. All right. This is good. This is very good. So here's your central controller board. This receives a radio signal and then processed it to drive both the servo. And then it had a probably a MOSFET speed controller here. That's probably what these chips are with the heat sinks on them that powered the motor. Whoops. So it was all integrated. It's all proprietary. You can't buy that today unless you buy, like I said, an old car and take it apart for parts. The good thing is a lot of these cars have this really crazy gearbox in the back. It's all sealed up. This is super simple. That looks like a 280 or a 380 motor, standard size. It's got 2 bolts here. You can see they're Loctited there, but they're just standard bolts on a plate, an pinion, a spur. It's got a pretty neat looking, I don't know if you can see that, planetary differential in there. So it actually has a diff in there. Doesn't lock up or anything, but lets both tires spin independently. Great for turning. And then the servo, another great thing. It's almost a hobby servo. We can't use it because we'd have to re-engineer the signal going into it. I'm not interested in that, but it looks like a regular standard hobby servo will bolt right in there, and we'll put the electronics down here somewhere out of the way. I think this is going to be an easy conversion, and it should be a lot of fun to run. So let's start taking it apart. All right, so we've got the car stripped out. Took all the electronics out that we wanted to remove. Left the motor in place, like I mentioned. We're gonna see how it runs with the factory motor. I'm sure it'll be more than adequate. Starting at the front, the servo popped right out. Just these 2 screws. Remove them. The strap popped off, and then this guy just pops right out. This little steering linkage with some Z-bends in it was in this hole like this, and then it attached over here to give you your steering. We're going to try to reuse this. It's probably going to line up pretty well with the new servo we get, and it's one less part that we have to figure out how to engineer. Moving back, we had a status LED and a charger port on the hood. So the charger port, we just snipped the wires right at the terminals on the charger port. And the LED, it was just sitting in this little holder here. There was nothing holding it in, just popped right out. That was easy. The controller board was held in with these 3 screws. So that comes right off. It did have 4 connections to the battery box. 2 wires went to this array of AA cells. The way these cars worked, these 4 AA cells would power this radio board. So it would give the board 6 volts and it would run the radio and the signal processing. And then the 5 C cells went to a separate circuit that provided power to the motor. I'm guessing these chips here, like I said before, are the actual speed controller circuit. The heat sinks kind of give them away because they get hot. So anyway, snipped them all right at the terminals. Left as much wire as possible on the board in case we ever want to reuse that. Moving to the back, the motor had 2 wires on it. I cut them, and then the switch had 4 or 5 wires on it. Cut them as well, right at the terminals. Before I did any of that, an important note is I took a very clear picture of everywhere a wire attached to this car. So that way we know what colors went to what terminals if and when we ever wanted to reinstall this board. And then one other little trick, tip, I guess. You'll see I put these screws back where they came from. Same thing with this little screw that held the antenna in place. I do that so you don't lose the screws. So, you know, we're going to put this board and this electronics aside and keep it safe somewhere just to keep with the car. But, you know, you might lose these screws along the way. If you put them back where they came from, they're going to stay there. And that way, a couple of years from now, if you ever go back into this thing, you'll know exactly where the parts are. They'll be where you left them. All right. One last thing for the top of the car. I like the rear suspension in this car. A lot of these cars had a plastic, a lot of these old toy cars had a plastic gearbox. It was all molded, part of the chassis. There was no suspension. If you're running them in your house, that's fine. But anywhere there's a little bumps, it would bounce along and, just not handle well. This actually has what looks like, it's very similar to a pan car, like a hobby grade pan car rear end. You got the flat plate, and you got this metal pod that holds the motor and the axle, and it actually floats on these springs here. I don't know if you can see that. So you get quite a bit of rear suspension on this thing. So that's going to help you, keep the tires on the ground when you're coming around a corner quickly, things like that. Front has no suspension. That's pretty typical. Sometimes you would see a little spring in there or something, but not on this car. That's about it for the top. Bottom of the car, the battery box. I already explained what batteries did what. We're only going to use a single pack to power this car with the new electronics. It's going to be a little bit of a challenge because a lot of cars later in the 80s and the 90s would use this type of 9.6 volt rechargeable pack. So it's basically 8 AA's, rechargeable AA's, all shrink wrapped and got a cable on it. If it used this type of pack, then the battery I want to use would drop right in there, no problem. However, with this C-cell setup, I've done other cars like this, so I know this will work, but it's a little more challenging. We're going to have to remove all these terminals, and we're going to try to remove them in such a way that they're not damaged, and we'll keep them with the controller board as, spare parts. The AA's, the AA terminals down there, we can leave them. These 2, we can leave them, but these 8 terminals here, we're going to take out. And we're going to use this lithium battery, or one very similar, to power the car. So this one in particular is a 3-cell. It's going to give you 11.1 volts. This car only ran on 7.5 volts from the factory. So it's definitely going to be a performance increase. We're going to have to closely monitor motor temperature and, see if it starts to show any signs that it's not tolerating that voltage. But once these terminals are removed, and I might have to just make some changes to the end of the pack here to get it to sit in there. This will go right in there. You can see there's a lot of side clearance, and the only challenge is going to be here. There's some padding up front here. I might route these wires back down around the side instead of out the front, and it'll fit in there. I've done it before with other cars, so that won't be a problem. That's about it. Next thing I got to do before we move forward, I'm going to just verify that a standard hobby servo will fit in there. I'll get all the parts ordered, and we will make part 2 of this video when the parts arrive. Alright, so that's all for today. One last thing I did notice, I hope you can see this. I noticed the front end was a little floppy when I took the body off and getting a look at it. We do have just a little crack, little hairline crack. I don't know if you can see them. You can't see it when the body's on because it closes up. But right here, found a little bit of a crack. It's not going to be a problem. We're going to glue it from the back side here so we don't see any glue on the outside of the car. And then once the body shell is attached, it's going to be super strong. There's a lot of structural rigidity in this body. It's going to keep the chassis from bending, so it's not going to get any worse. But you know, we'll address it, throw some glue on it just to make sure. All right, I hope you enjoyed the video. Stay tuned for part 2 when we get the electronics in. Be sure to check out my website, StevesHobbies.com, and subscribe to this channel if you'd like to see additional updates and more content. Thank you for watching.